let's go ahead and get started. I'll look at the camera when I say that. Um, Need to let you know something about how this is going to go, because um, as we go through Revelation, as we're getting into the meat stuff now, the real heavy, even the heavier stuff than the seven letters, and we have to really dig in. And so as we start, it's going to take longer because we have to establish things. Let me say what I mean by that. There are four sources that are coming together in this apocalyptic literature, and they're all impacting it in big ways. And so as we go through, especially this first part of chapter 4, we're going to have to stop a lot and explain things. We're going to come upon a symbol, and we're going to go, okay, what does that mean? We're coming across a number, and that number has real significance. We'll have to stop and explain that symbol or that number or that Old Testament image that's popping in or that cultural image that's popping in. And in chapter 4, we're like, I'm only planning to do it in 5 verses today. And we're not going to stay there. It's not going to stay really slow. Because as we learn what a symbol represents, we don't need to explain it every time. And we don't need to explain a number every time we hit it. But that first time, and there a lot of stuff here in chapter 4, it's going to be the first time we've seen it, or seen it in a context we have to explain, because there are four, like I said, there are 4 different things that are really coming to bear, and we have to make sure we're getting them right. Okay? One is there's a lot of use of Old Testament symbols and words and images and stories. And when we hit one of those, we're going to have to make sure we have it, that we understand it, so we understand what's going on in Revelation. But there's also a ton of stuff coming from Roman culture. We saw that in the 7 letters, how the stuff that was going around them in their cities and in their culture was huge. And especially the Romans had a thing for imperial worship, where they kind of worshiped the Roman state and worshiped the emperor. And there's a lot of attacks that John's going to make on that as he's going through here, and we have to stop and explain that when we get there. The 7 letters, by the way, laid a foundation for all of this. Okay? And we're going to have to frequently, especially at the beginning here, we're going to have to say, wait a second, remember that was from the 7 letters. That's something that John established when he did those 7 letters. And then there are numbers, and numbers are huge, and we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about numbers and how we understand the different numbers that are going to come at us as we're working our way through this. And we're going to start, let's just go ahead and start in Revelation chapter 4, okay? After this, I looked, and there before me was a door standing open. And the voice I had first heard, speaking to me like a trumpet, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. Now, one thing that can happen as you are first reading Revelation, the very first few chapters, is it seems like it's disjointed. It seems like all these, it's almost like a hodgepodge of stuff stuck together. You start out with the brief introduction at the very beginning is like a normal letter from that era. Then it breaks into this apocalyptic letter where, you've got symbols and trumpets and, all this symbology going on. And then it stops with the symbols, it stops with the apocalyptic and switches into letters that are more like imperial edicts. They're not really that apocalyptic in the way they're written, a little bit, but a lot of it is very strongly these edicts from the king, who in this case is Jesus, or the emperor. And now we come to Revelation 4, and we suddenly switch back to apocalyptic. But one of the first things that John does is tie it all together, because he says, I looked, and there before me was a door standing open. If you remember, the last 2 churches, Philadelphia and Laodicea, both featured doors. There was in Philadelphia, there was the door that was standing open, that God had opened and no one could shut. And that door was the door into fellowship with God. It was the ability to come into the presence of God. And then we come to Laodicea, and there's a closed door. There's a closed door that the people of Laodicea have shut between them and Jesus is knocking at the door saying, I want to come in with you, will you let me in? Okay? And now we start out chapter 4 with an open door. Okay? There's a door standing open in heaven. So this is an invitation for us to go in, but it's also a reminder about the 7 churches. That's what's going on. And then the next thing it says is that there's a trumpet and a voice sounding like a trumpet. That's the first voice he heard. And that goes back to chapter 1, verse 10, which is the introduction to the book. On the Lord's day I was in the Spirit and heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. So we're tying all that together, and John is telling us right up front, okay, that opening that was a little bit odd and apocalyptic, and these 7 letters that almost seemed out of place, this is all part of how we're moving forward. And you're going to have to bring all that along as you're going. You can't just take the 7 letters and forget about them from now on. They're a big part of what's happening. And all the stuff we talked about with Imperial Rome, that's going to keep coming. All the Old Testament stuff, it's going to keep coming. We're building something, and the 7 letters to the 7 churches was a foundation for that, okay? So, go to verse 2. At once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it. And that's weird. That's weird. If you go to heaven, what do you want to see? God, maybe? What did he see? A throne. And how's he define God? Someone sitting on the throne. That's it. there's the throne. As we go through this, the throne is the center. Everybody who's in here, everybody who's described in chapter 4 of Revelation, and probably on into chapter 5, which is kind of one continuous big scene, is defined in relation to the throne. And why is that? The throne represents, what do you think throne would represent? Power. The throne is power. And so this power is here. The power of God is here on this throne, and the one who sits on it is, of course, God. And everybody who's in this entire chapter is defined as how they're in relation to the throne. Okay? It's the center of everything. Okay? And if you remember in Laodicea, go back to the letter. The letter to Laodicea, the very end of that letter said, the one who is victorious, I give the right to sit with me on my throne. Okay? Just as I was victorious and sat down with my Father on his throne. So we've got this power center. There's something going on. And let me just keep going. I got some interesting stuff I want to talk about as we keep moving, okay? Now, there's a description of God. And the one who sat there had the appearance of jasper and ruby, a rainbow that shone like an emerald encircled the throne. So we've got God on the throne, and it's something you'll actually see a lot. Anytime God shows up in a vision of some kind like this, like in Ezekiel and Isaiah, there's not a lot of time spent describing God. It's all describing what's around him because he's indescribable. So they spend a lot of time talking about what he's sitting on, what he's standing on, who's carrying and who's talking to him, all that kind of stuff. And of course, it talks about a rainbow. Anybody remember anything about a rainbow in the Bible? Yeah, that's Noah, the rainbow, God's protection. God's promises, God's covenant, God's protection is the rainbow. And the jewels, I don't think the jewels have a lot of, they're just jewels. Okay, it's more a matter of, they're about the glory. There's this incredible glory, God's covenant, God's protection. And now we'll start getting into the, okay, we sort of set the base scene. There's this throne, God sitting on the throne. We've come in through an open door, the door of fellowship, into the throne room. And now we start getting into the stuff that's the symbols and the numbers we have to stop and explain, okay? Verse 4, surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders. And again, it starts with the throne. Okay, it starts, here's the throne, and on the throne are the elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their heads. And now, almost everything I just mentioned comes to play. I think pretty much everything I mentioned. The Old Testament stuff, the cultural stuff, the number stuff, and the previous letters, the 7 letters to the 7 churches of Revelation. All of it comes to bear on these elders. To understand and see what's going on with the elders, we pull from all 4 of our sources. It's really, I think it's really cool. Hopefully you think it's really cool, because we're going to spend some time talking about that. First thing it's really interesting. This section, 1 through 4, pulls from 4 of the letters. If you look at it, in Laodicea there are thrones. In Sardis, the people are given white garments. In Smyrna, it says they were dressed in white, had crowns of gold on their heads. In Smyrna, they're given crowns. And of course, in Philadelphia, there's that door that is open. There's an open door in Philadelphia. And it's, okay, I think I told you this. This book is incredibly well constructed. This is not accidental. John has taken his time to be very careful in how he puts this whole thing together. And it's really kind of interesting. There are 7 churches. He talks about 4. The 4 are Laodicea, Sardis, Smyrna, and Philadelphia. Laodicea is probably the worst church of the bunch. There is not a, remember, there's a commendation or a condemnation in most of the 7 church letters. Laodicea and Sardis didn't get commendations, they just got condemnations. They were terrible. However, the 2 best churches, Smyrna and Philadelphia, didn't get condemnations, they only got commendations, and the 4 churches are the 2 best and the 2 worst. Which probably implies all of them. Okay, so here we've got the 2 best, the 2 worst, and we're tying this all together. So we've got from that the 7 letters. All the 7 churches are represented in this 24 elders. Now, why 24? What's that got to do with this thing? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the numbers were huge in the way the Greeks and the Jews viewed things. And often there'd be real subtle differences in the way they did it. And that shows up in here. Now, as we talk about numbers, we have to be very, very, very careful. Because a lot of people try to take modern number theory and throw it back there. Or not even number theory. Somebody comes up with a theory, goes and counts the numbers in Revelation, and comes up with a theory on how to understand Revelation based on their numbers. And the problem is, it's not the number theory that they would have used. It's nothing that the original hearers or John would have ever considered. So we can't do that. We can't expect them to take our knowledge and apply it to their numbers. However, in the ancient world, they were seriously into it. And when we find out their numbers, like for instance, 7 is going to be in this book constantly. The number 7 is used all the time. Now, why the number 7? Well, 7 is the number of completion. They believed there were 7 planets. There were 7 days of the week. There were a number of things where everything was completed with the number 7. So 7's the number of completion. So if 7's the number of completion, and he talks about 7 churches in the 7 letters, how many churches is he actually talking to? All of them. Matter of fact, if you went through with us all the 7 churches of Revelation, you probably found that every church you've ever attended had similarities with at least some of those, and each of us as Christians looked at those 7 and we had similarities with a lot of the issues we found in that there. Okay, matter of fact, to let you know, they were big on numbers. Let me tell you how big it is. There's a piece of graffiti in Pompeii which says, "I love her whose number is 545." Because how they did it was they would take the letters and numbers corresponded. To put it in English, A would be 1, B would be 2, C would be 3. They didn't have separate numbers. They just had letters, and the letters had number assignments. And so you could take somebody's name and take S would be whatever letter S is in the alphabet. Let's do somebody named Abby. A is 1 point, B is 2 points, another B is 2 more points. We're now at 5. Y is 25 points. So Abby's number would be 30. Okay? And so this number, I love her whose number is Pompeii, is 545, because she would go, "Oh, that's me," and nobody else would be able to tell for sure. It's interesting. We know that the number of the beast is 666. That's the number that adds up. Did you know that the number for Jesus is 888? Same. And so all that all clicked with them. They understood it. And then they took it to a whole nother level, because they looked at things like square numbers. Square numbers are huge. We're going to see a lot of square numbers. 144 is going to show up from time to time. 1,000. Okay, those are going to show up because they like square numbers. They also liked squares and triangular numbers. I'm not going to try to explain that. It's really weird, and I'll just point out when it happens. But the Hebrew altar was square, and so square numbers are good. Okay, but the heathen altars, the other altars, might be triangular. So triangular numbers are bad. I'll give you one triangular number. 666 is a triangular number. It's a bad number. So numbers are bad or good. Matter of fact, the number symbology was so important that John would tweak the numbers to get into a symbol. Okay, some of you are going to not be as happy with this about as it could be. In Daniel, he talks about a certain number of days happening. He talks about 1,290 days and 1,335 days. Okay, neither of which is divisible by anything cool. John, when he takes Daniel's prophecy, he changes those numbers to 1,260, which is divisible by 7. It's one of the 7 squares that comes in with all these things. And so he's going to modify, he'll even tweak numbers to get them into the thing, which is a really hard lesson for us moderns to take, because we want the numbers to be literal. And a lot of times they were more interested, John is, in this book is more interested in getting you the symbol than he is the literal number. He wants you to get the symbol more than the literal. And some of you are going, I don't like that, that's not right. It doesn't matter what we like. Way too often as Christians, we come to the Bible and we want to say what we like or to act like we like. I was having a conversation with a good friend last week, and she didn't like the fact that, I forget what it was exactly, where a number, where something, I think it was a number even, it wasn't literal, it was meant as a symbol, and she didn't like that at all. And she didn't like the concept of hyperbole, where people exaggerate, and they're like, God can't exaggerate. And I said, God does exaggerate, and God does overstate things to make his point. Jesus did it. And so then I gave her the example nobody likes to talk about. Jesus said, and you guys can look this up, and most of you know this is in there. Jesus said, if a dude has trouble with lusting for women, if he looks at women lustfully, he should, and I'm paraphrasing here, cut off his junk. That's what Jesus said. Okay? In my life, I have yet to meet a single Christian man who took that literally. And I don't know I've ever met a Christian man who doesn't have trouble looking with the concept of looking at women in the wrong way. And I've yet to meet a man who took that verse literally. Everybody on earth, there was one original church father who took it literally. He's famous for it. But everybody since then has said, oh, that's just hyperbole. It's just a symbol. It's not real. He doesn't really want us to do that. He's just emphasizing how important it is. And it is so important that we let the Bible be the Bible. Let it speak as it speaks instead of trying to make it fit into a box that we're comfortable with. And if you're uncomfortable with the idea that John's going to take numbers and tweak them to get across his symbols, well, you've got a problem with the Bible, not with me. Okay, I'm going to give you one more. You're going to hate me for this. You're going to absolutely hate me for this. In the beginning, the very beginning of the New Testament, you're going to hate me. You're going to hate me. In the beginning of the New Testament, the book of Matthew starts out with a genealogy. And when he finishes the genealogy, he says, and there are 14 generations from like Abraham to this, and from David to this, and from this person to the Messiah. And he says 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. And most of you have never looked that up. Okay? You've not checked on it, but you know how many generations there actually are in each of those. There are places we can tell. We can go back to the genealogy in the books of Kings, and we can count, and he left out people to make it add up to 14. He did. I'm not making it up. I didn't write the book. You can go back to Matthew, and you go back where he lists this king was the son of this king, was the son of this king, was the son of this king. And if you go back into Kings, you will find people he left out, like 3 or 4 kings, because it was more important for him to get to 14, one of the most important numbers in the Bible. 2 times 7. I mentioned this yesterday. 7's the number of completion. 2 is the number of the faithful witness. So now you've got the complete and faithful witness. So he makes it go to 14. And you may think, Steve, I'm just telling you what happens. And my job isn't to say, as a modern thinker, that God has to apply to my rules of how he had to write his book. He wrote the book. I didn't write it. My job, though, is not to inflict all of my stuff on it. My job is to read it for what it really says. And so, as we're coming to the book of Revelation, recognize if you find a number, any number, and it fits very squarely into a symbol, it's probably more important about the symbol than it is the literal number that is there. That's modern thinking trying to inflict our view on it. So when he says, for instance, 7 years of tribulation, what that means is the tribulation is complete. Okay? It could be 8 years, it could be 10, it could be 5. I'm not saying it is, it might be exactly 7. But the important part for John was making sure the number was 7, because the symbol was more important for him than the literal. I know you're hating that, but I'm telling you, that's how the Bible runs itself. That's how the Bible is written. I didn't make it up, and I'm not trying to force you to think something. I'm telling you that's what it says. So anyway, sorry. Okay, so let's look at this. Number 24 then. Back to that again. Okay? We talked about 7. Well, 24 and 7, that's not there. What is 24? Okay? Well, 24 is 12 times 2. 2, again, faithful witness. It takes 2 witnesses. Any matter is developed in presence of 2 witnesses. So anytime he just doubles something, he's saying that this number is confirmed. It is affirmed. Now, what about 12? 12 is one of God's favorite numbers, too. And it's not about months. It's about kingdom of God. Because how many tribes were there in Israel? 12. How many apostles were there? 12. Okay? And you'll see that throughout the Bible. Matter of fact, in the book of Acts, Judas, you remember Judas? Judas betrays Christ and kills himself, and therefore they're down to 11. And what's one of the first things they do in the book of Acts? After Judas kills himself, they go out and find Matthias and go through a process to bring in one more dude. Why? Because it has to be 12. 12 is the number that represents God's kingdom and God's covenant. Okay? So, here it is. We've got the 24 elders represent all the churches. They represent the leaders, elders are leaders, and they are the leaders of all the churches, of all the kingdom of God throughout history. Okay? So that's what that 12 means. Now, let me skip this to this other part first. Now, the next thing, we got to go back to the Old Testament culture. We're looking at these 24 elders, because what's important from the cultural standpoint is that they are dressed in white and they're wearing golden crowns. To us, that's a little weird. But in that part of the empire, there, what we would now call Turkey, this goes back way before this, all the way back to Alexander the Great. They would have a thing where they would bring the elders of the cities, they would dress them up in white, they would put gold crowns on their heads, and they would come as delegates before the ruler. Like when the emperor would pass through, the cities would send out their elders dressed in white, wearing gold crowns, or wreaths, which is what we would actually call. They would then, you want to guess what the rulers would do? These elders, they would come out, they would bow before the king, the emperor, the leader, and they would lay their crowns at his feet. And you probably know what's coming here at the end of the chapter. What these 24 elders are going to do, right? They're going to come before the throne, and they're going to bow down and lay their crowns at the feet of God. And so for us, that's a weird symbol. For them, that's what leaders do when they come before the true king. Okay? Now, one more thing. We'll finish up verse 5 relatively quickly. So we got the throne, we've got the 24 elders, we've got us there because of the open door. And then from the throne came flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. That's an interesting choice of 3 things. Oh, let's go to the Old Testament and see where that comes from. It comes from Exodus 19. And if you're a Bible geek at all, you know what Exodus 20 is, the 10 Commandments. God's about to give them the 10 Commandments. They're up on the mountain with God, and it says in Exodus 19:16, on the mountain of the third day there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain. Lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. So we're God's presence. Just like they were in Exodus 19 when they got the 10 Commandments, they are in God's presence. And then the last piece of verse 5. In front of the throne, 7 lamps were blazing. These are the 7 spirits of God. And again, 7 is the number of completion. So you're going, what are the 7 spirits? I thought there was only one Holy Spirit. Well, what that means is just completion. That is God's Spirit is fully present. God the Father is fully present. We know that because, right, there's the clouds, the thunder, the recall to Exodus 19. God's Spirit is fully present because he says 7 spirits. Okay, the 7 spirits of God. That doesn't mean there are 7 of them. It means it's a completion. It is the full presence of God. And fire, of course, is the picture. There, the lamps were blazing. Fire is often the picture of the Holy Spirit. So we've got the full, complete, the Holy Spirit, who is normally everywhere, is now in for this moment. This is power. Think about this for a second. God's Spirit is normally presented as being everywhere present, but at this moment, God's Spirit is completely present in this throne room before God. Okay? Today we've set the scene. Tomorrow we're going to move into the action, introduce the hero, things like that. But let me just read this to you. What's going on in this thing? John, believing the church faces an immediate life and death battle, which is not theirs alone but God's, is summoned to the control room at Supreme Headquarters. He is coming into heaven, it's not really set up as a worship place, it's presented as a power place. Okay? This is the place of power, and John is brought into the room of power because there is a life or death situation with the church, and God is assembling for battle. He's assembling all his resources. God is preparing for battle. And in that room, we have been brought in with John. And now tomorrow we get to see what God's up to. As now instead of just being in the room, God yells, action. Okay? All right. Thanks for coming. We'll see you again tomorrow. Have a great day.